Honor invited guests, it's my pleasure to recognize Mr. Tom Ewing with the Snellville Historical Society. He'll give us sound bites of Snellville. Mr. Ewing.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. It's good to be here again. Last time I spoke to you, we talked of the Civil War era, 5 years covering the Civil War, or some of you prefer to refer to it in a different manner. 4 points that we left you with was the soldiers of this community fought bravely and vigorously for the cause they thought were right. The surviving soldiers came home. They started over with and with farmers and an agricultural economy. There was little other that was available to them. As a community, they were affected as most others in the South, both the North and the South. They did not suffer in this community, meaning Cates District for the most part, from direct battle or pillage. I want to make one correction. I told you the last time, if you remember, that when the foragers, or bombers as we call them down here in the South, crossed Yellow River on Five Forks Chickham Road, I said they didn't reach Cates District. They did. I went back and looked at the line. That was Cates District. However, I still find no record of where they were in the quote-unquote Snellville community. Now, with that, I'm going to try to cover about 14 years tonight in a shorter period of time than I did the last time. From 1865 to 1879. The men came home from the Civil War by various means. If they could hitch a ride on a wagon, they probably did. The trains were not running. They couldn't call a Greyhound bus. Delta wasn't flying. Nothing else was available. They walked, for the most part, they walked. All are part of the way. Maybe a train was running now and then, and they hopped on a vacant freight car. Beyond that, they walked. Large landowners, the so-called plantations in the area, had big adjustments after the war. I volunteer up at Gwinnett County Historical Society, and I think I'm correct in saying this. I didn't go back and check it, but at least one large landowner after the Civil War committed suicide because he couldn't deal with the situation involving managing a large plantation with no labor, no help. He didn't know how to manage it, really, is what it amounted to. They had big adjustment problems. There was not enough labor. There was no labor to hire. A lot of the men were killed. A lot of men came home invalid. And the ones that were not part of the big plantation had their own farms to see after. There was no labor available to hire. So it was the blacks who were previous slaves. Many of them remained with the families where they had been slave owners. Others didn't. They left, went on their way. Others roamed the country looking trying to figure it out for themselves. So what did the large landowners do? They split up. They either sold off parts of their land for a pittance because the economy was terrible shape, or they divided up the land and gave it to the children and said, okay, John, here's your 200 acres. You're on your own. A lot of that happened. Now, the independent farmers, and remember I told you that there was a much larger number of independent farmers than there were large landowners, the so-called plantations. They didn't have near as hard a time because we kind of referred to them throughout as survival farmers anyway. So they had much less problems adjusting, except for the wounded and sick. They just came back and picked up where they're at. Some of their livestock was gone. They probably didn't have seed corn to plant the next year. They had to figure out where to get that. But they went right back where they were at, basically. So the adjustment for them was not nearly as great. They began improving their homes and farm buildings. They planted crops in the summertime, grazed their crops, and in the wintertime they cleared more land, cut down the forest. The forest was not important. It had very little economical value. Crops were important, especially cotton. So the way they expanded their farms is by clearing more land each year. The returning soldiers, both north and south, basically did the same thing. They picked up their lives and moved on as best they could. That's the way it was here in Cage's district. Reconstruction. That's something we didn't like to talk about much in the South. Many of the Southerners referred to it as occupation. The controversy among the local people that was here before the Civil War, and as you recall, I told you everybody was not for secession. In fact, our representative voted against it to begin with. That controversy lingered on after the war. It took a while for this to smooth out. Some people were glad the war was over. They had had enough. I wonder how they'd have felt about the 10-year deal we're in right now. Some thought they should have continued to fight, but I don't know what with. We had exhausted just about everything the South had in the terms of food, and industrial equipment, and manpower, and will. They went about as far as they could. But some still said they gave up too soon. They should have kept fighting, but they may not have been the ones that were out there fighting. There were poor whites walking the roads. And why? Well, the independent farmers come back, and maybe they didn't have any livestock. But I told you that the Northerners may not have got into this area. But what's not said an awful lot of the time is we had to support the Southern Army. And many times the livestock, the mules, and the horses were either bought or confiscated and sent to the Southern Army. So when they came home, they may have had to start over, developing the livestock. The livestock was the power in which to run the farm with. There were a lot of poor blacks available, walking the roads. They were trying to figure out what to do with their lives. They were free, but what do we do now? They had no training, and Reconstruction really didn't work. They didn't really get training for those people to live a profitable life in an agricultural economy in the South. So that took some time and some adjustment. People hardly ever think about that. So what happened? The poor whites and the poor blacks became sharecroppers of those who owned land. You would get 25 acres of land to farm, use the owner's mule, and you raise yourself some corn and some oats to feed the livestock that you had, your milk cow. You would raise the corn and a few acres of cotton, and then at the end of the year when you did that, the owner took a part of it and you kept a part of it. And that's the way it worked for many years. And I'm here to tell you that I lived in that area in the 1930s, right up to World War II. Sharecropping was a primary or an important part of the agricultural economy in this area and almost all the South, right up to World War II. The term carpetbaggers came about. What's a carpetbagger? Well, it's mostly explained to me this way. It was the Yankees that were coming down to see what they could do down here in the South about making a living, and when they would get off the train at the railroad station, they were carrying a bag, and it was made of material that looked like a carpet. Thus the name carpetbaggers. I don't think that the Cage's district was affected very much of that because, let's face it, there was no significant towns here then. There was no railroads and what have you. But it was here, and they walked the roads, and they tried to sell people things and what have you. So the term carpetbaggers stayed on and on for years. Scalawags, have you heard that term? call somebody a scalawag. It was boys used to do it for devilment and what have you. Started out right after the Civil War. That referred to anybody that was of the Republican ilk. They were scalawags, and it was a serious reference at that time, and later on it became lighter and lighter and lighter. The Ku Klux Klan. Started by an ex-Confederate general, I believe, up in Tennessee. The Ku Klux Klan was active locally. As a child, I learned, all children, most part, learned to fear them. I think that's what they intended everybody to do, to be afraid of them. They were kind of scary looking in their white robes and pointed hats and what have you. As a teenager, a little bit adventurous, when I got up to driving, I went over to Stone Mountain and parked a distance away from where they were having one of their rallies and walked up to about 50 yards, dark, where nobody could see us, 2 or 3 of us, and we observed what went on during the rally. There was a lot of haranguing and speeches and what have you, and eventually they were burning a cross over there. I knew a lot of the men in the community that were said to be members of the Ku Klux Klan. They were well-to-do members of the community. They were not considered anti-American. They were concerned about a lot of things. But one thing they don't ever tell you about that they did things other than chase the ex-slaves. Stories that I heard, whether they're true or not, some no good in the community who would find a quart of liquid corn on a Saturday afternoon, you would not go home until you drank that whole quart. You didn't have a few drinks and then be social and what have you, and sometimes you didn't make it home. And if this continued on and your family got in dire straits and they weren't being fed and what have you, several of the Ku Klux Klan people would load up in a car and they would go visit this gentleman, and it'd be amazing how fast he would sober up and straighten up. You very seldom, or if ever, heard any of that type of publicity about the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not defending them. I'm just saying the whole story was never told. Certainly, there were white supremacists, plus many other things. I don't doubt that. They were here, and they were part of that era, and they stayed on. And today, every once in a while on TV, it pops up again, but not like it was back in those times. Was Reconstruction successful? Research indicated that it was a failure. The North finally gave it up about 1877, did away with it. There was lack of cooperation during the Reconstruction. The troops were here. They didn't, I don't think, really overbearing or anything like that, but they were available, and the South didn't like it was here. Well, you can expect that. The losers always are not happy with people that overseeing you afterwards. But they were here all during the occupation, overseeing elections and what have you. Those of us who do this sort of thing as a hobby and do research, I can give you 2 examples. Marriage records during the period of Reconstruction oftentimes were never recorded. They didn't want to cooperate with the local authorities. So they'd get a license and get married, but it would never get recorded, never get turned into the county government. Another thing that happened is the 1870 census, 5 years after the Civil War. There were families here in 1860. The same family was here in 1880. There's no record of it in 1870. They didn't leave. Those people taking the census represented the U.S. government. So sometimes they didn't get recorded, and you can figure out your own reasons what may have happened when the census taker came to your farm to record the census. Some of the returning soldiers and their families left and went west, primarily to Texas. Some of them stayed there, and they're still there today, and their descendants are there. But many of them returned, came back to Georgia, and I talked to you about one of them with the 42nd Georgia who had gone out there, and his wife brought the family back here and raised them. All the states that were in the secession wanted to return to statehood, and Georgia was readmitted to the Union in July of 1870. Things started to get a little better after that. Now, did it directly affect this community? I doubt if it directly affected the community, but it affected the county government and other things which supported them. So things started to get better after 1870 and much better after 1877. News from New York. Teenagers have landed. Charles and James Sawyer, age 18 and 17, arrived in New York on April the 1st, 1874, and they headed south. Why, we don't know, because family folklore had it that they were going west and maybe join up and help fight the Indians. Anyway, they headed south. Reality probably set in, and they needed to eat. Let's face it, 17 and 18 years old, alone in a foreign country, with the economy's in terrible shape, no jobs available. Think about it. Think about your 18-year-olds out there. About 6 months later, they were joined in Madison County, Georgia, by their friend Joseph Thomas Snell. And they continued south to Gwinnett County, and they were walking. There were no buses running, no stagecoaches. They were walking. The reason I know that, in an interview with Mr. Sawyer by Mr. Whitworth, what is published, it was stated in there that they were walking through Lawrenceville on a Sunday afternoon. And they had bought a shotgun and a pistol. And they were carrying their bags, across the street, and a bunch of young guys on the wooden sidewalk of town, if you would, started picking at them. They were funny-looking fellows from England, didn't dress like Southerners did. Well, one of them wanted to take them on, but the other two talked them out of it, and they continued on. So that's how I know they were walking when they came on that. They first worked for a fellow named Austin. Didn't work out too well. Worked a couple, 3 months for him. Didn't get much for it except their board, room and board. Then they worked for a fellow named A.G. Holmes. Do you remember me talking about him? One of the large landowners close to Snellville. They worked for him for 3 or 4 months, 5 or 6 months. Can you imagine guys out of a store, grew up in London, England, that is doing farm work? I suspect the guys didn't think they'd earn very much because they probably didn't know how to work on a farm. But they persevered. They kept going. By now, it's late 1874, early 1875. It's 10 years after the Civil War when the Snell and Sawyer walked into Gwinnett County. 10 years after the Civil War. Charles left, went back to Pennsylvania. And soon, James left, tried to find him, to join him. He never found him. He spent about 2 years up in the New York State, and he came back to Keats's district and joined his friend Snell, who had by this time married and had one child, his only child. While they were gone, Mr. Snell had acquired a small country store. I visualize a little one-room shack in the stock of that store. So he must have been quite an industrious young man. In 1879, the two of them joined, 1879, and built a wooden building in what is now the southwest corner of 78 and 124, where that tire place and factory is. It's a wooden store first. That in mind, we'll talk about that some more next week. They formed a partnership, the general merchandise store. They're both now 22 years old. More to come, and you will see in the next 2 sessions how the group of farmers throughout starts to form a community, we start to become a little bit of an economy here, some education, some religious activity, some medical people move in, so things are starting to come together in the next 2 sessions. So tonight I want to leave you with 3 points. The soldiers and the families in Keach's district after the Civil War put their lives back together and moved on with their farm life as best they could. They had continued with Reconstruction and had instilled in them and their children a dislike for Northerners. Sorry about that, folks. Which they call Yankees. And for Republicans and their ilk, referred to as scalawags. James Sawyer and Joseph Thomas Snell have arrived and settled in the community. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. Do appreciate this, and it's a shame that I won't be sitting here in the center seat for the rest of yours. I'll be in the audience enjoying your presentation, but thank you again for sharing that. All right, that is all we have for invited guests. We have some committee department reports.